What if we can't agree? That's today's topic. Among God's people, what if we can't agree on some issue? Can we walk together? Should we walk together? And what if we have a deeper understanding and maybe they don't get it? What if we just can't agree? Let me start out by saying it's not my intention to be confrontational. So if I do step on any toes, I do apologize. But the world around us is increasingly fragmenting. Even powerful movements that started out with unity and with purpose are seeing divisions break out over relatively minor issues. We see entire societies fragmenting into smaller and smaller components. Now, it shouldn't be so among God's people. In fact, we should walk together. For us to have a God-powered life, we need to be able to walk together in fellowship. That we need to be able to edify each other. And in doing so, God is glorified and it begins to impact the world around us. So how do we reconcile when there's issues that appear to be important, that we wind up taking very firm stands on, and we can't agree? Now, obviously, there are some core tenets that are absolutely non-negotiable. One of which is that we serve a holy, righteous God, and because of His holiness and our sin, nothing we do will allow us to meet His standards and reconcile to Him. But because of His great and amazing love, that He paid this amazing price by sacrificing His Son to make a way for us to truly be reconciled to this loving God, the Father of the universe. Those are non-negotiables, but we get beyond that. Most other things we get hung up on are not as important as we make them out to be. We get hung up on things. Now, I'm going to give you a very real example, and we're going to circle back to this at the end. I had a really good friend. Now, he's since passed, but this was one of my closest personal friends. But he was so convinced that God's people should never drink alcohol that he literally said that when Jesus turned the water into wine, it was really just grape juice. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, I have very dear friends that in their church, when doing communion, serve wine because they're imitating what Jesus did. So how can we walk together when we're so diametrically opposed? But first off, we have to stop and examine what's the motive, what's the motivation. Now let me say, these kind of divisions, these disagreements, this is not new. This has been from the foundation of the earth. But fortunately, somebody much smarter than me has already addressed this. And we see that in Romans 14. So Paul talking to the Romans. Now, this is mind-blowing. And it really hits me because what happens? We get a conviction about some issue. In fact, he starts out talking about he who is full of faith can eat anything. And another's faith only allows them to eat vegetables. Now, we, on whatever the issue is, we develop this standard, this conviction that becomes non-negotiable. And what happens is it causes us to exclude anyone who can't meet that same standard. So Paul talking about the one whose faith will allow them to eat anything, and another's whose faith only allows them to eat vegetables. Now he makes a bold statement which should challenge us. Don't look at this. When I share this with you, don't look at this as confirmation that your side of the position was correct. But he says the one that could eat anything is strong in the faith. And he says the one that could only eat vegetables is weak in the faith. Now, I don't want you to look at it as which one is better and which one's not. As we come back to this, let's recognize it's about regarding someone else. Because see, whatever our take is on a position, we become convinced we have a deeper understanding. And if they just had the same understanding we have, that they would come to our way of thinking. So when we consider that other side, look at them as the weaker one, and it's about respecting and honoring them. Now, he says an interesting thing, talking about one has the faith to eat anything and another has only the faith to eat vegetables. And he says something very challenging to you and I. And he says that the one whose faith can eat anything should not despise the one that eats only vegetables. See, we shouldn't look down upon them like, I can do more than you. That's not the intention. And he says that the one that eats only vegetables should not pass judgment on the one who eats everything. See, this becomes a division that separates us and does not allow us to walk together. And I'm not talking about food. I'm talking about whatever the issue is, whether it's alcohol, food. In fact, he goes on and he says, one honors one day more than the next. Ministries get into arguments over which day honors God more. But what does Paul say? He says, whichever it is, do it fully convinced it's the right thing. Now, can you and I be fully convinced this day is the day to honor God, and somebody else be fully convinced another is the day to honor God? And can we both be right? Interesting concept, huh? You know, what happens is we get these hard positions and we believe something and we get so locked up in it. And we actually make it more sometimes than even God showed us. On a side note, this one always intrigued me. Genesis 3. Now this is where the serpent is tricking Eve. And he says, did God really say you can't eat this? And she goes further. She says, he said we can't eat it and we can't even touch it. See, we begin to add and build on to these perceptions, rules, guidelines, whatever it may be. Could it be that God gives some freedom in an area for a reason? And could it be that he doesn't give freedom to another for a reason? And those reasons are entirely his. The point is, you and I are to walk out the convictions, again, with those basic tenets in place, those convictions that God gave us, whether it's a freedom or a restriction, which I will come back to because this one really challenged me later on in life. Now, he says something really interesting, and again, he talks about whatever we should do it fully convinced. And in fact, at the very end, I challenge you to go look at this for yourself. At the very end of Romans 14, he says, whatever it is, don't doubt. Because whenever we doubt, we don't walk in faith. And whatever is not of faith is sin. I didn't say it. Paul said it. It's the very end of Romans 14. I think that speaks not just to this issue, but so many more. We need to honor each other and recognize God calls people to different things. In the Old Testament, we had the Nazarites who, in their commitment to God, lived a different lifestyle. They couldn't have wine, they didn't cut their hair, etc. Now, that did not mean God didn't love the others. David was not a Nazarite, and he was a man after God's own heart. They had a different role and a different purpose. In the New Testament, again, now this is a little bit different issue, but Jesus says to Peter, feed my sheep. And at the very end of that entire section, Peter says to Jesus, looking at John, he says, what about him? See, Jesus had shown Peter the manner of death, that he would die to serve Christ. And the rumor was about John, which was not the case, but the rumor was about John that he wouldn't die until the Lord returned. And so Peter, looking at John, says to Jesus, what about him? And Jesus said something really challenging. And effectively what he said, if he remains if he's alive until I return, what does that matter to you? Each one of us is to do what God has called us to do. So there are times God gives one of us a freedom in an area for a reason. Now, often we don't know that reason for many years later. Sometimes he gives us a restriction for a reason. And we may not see that reason for many years later. Now, but what we need to understand is when God shows us something, and I've seen this so often, even among friends, and I probably have done it myself to be fair. When God shows us something, we immediately think that everyone else should get it and adjust to it and imitate what we're doing, whether it's a freedom or a restriction. Rather, we should learn to respect. See, what does Paul say? That one who is strong in the faith, using the term weak, because we look at someone whose conviction is different than ours, we see them as weaker. We see them as lacking the same degree of understanding. And so, again, I'm not trying to be controversial. What I'm trying to do is challenge us to recognize each one of God's people is a holy possession of the living God. That is one of His cherished children. And we start to look down on each other over issues. You know, coming back to my friend who didn't drink and didn't believe Christians should. Years later, we found out he had genetic cirrhosis of the liver. For him to drink alcohol would have been horribly detrimental to his health. See, God had given him a conviction, a restriction, because it was good for him. Now, fortunately, he had the wisdom. He was a pastor of a church, and among the leaders, there was a little bit of division at one point. He didn't want God's leaders to drink alcohol. There were some other, like, hang on, that's not in the Bible. But he had the wisdom to mediate and to find a middle answer. And so basically the permission was to do so in respect. Make sure when you're out in public with others that this isn't an issue for them. That out of respect for someone that it might be an issue for, that you would abstain. See, it's not about whether we can walk together. It's not about whether we should walk together, but rather, how do we make a way to walk together?